Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of What's on My Desk. I love saying that. It brings back such great memories of how this whole thing started on YouTube. Today I have the kid whiz Marco with me, and we're here to talk about the godfather of all watchmaking. You guessed it, Breguet, as you like to call it, or I call it Breguet. I guess I'll jump right into it and I'll ask Marco, why the godfather of all watchmaking?
I mean, when you talk about the history of watchmaking, you'd be hard-pressed not to mention the Breguet name. The reason is quite simply because he is, by far and away, without a doubt, the consensus greatest watchmaker of all time. What he accomplished in the short period that he did, obviously, watchmaking, is nothing short of spectacular. He was a visionary, a genius, a true innovator, and without a doubt, again, the greatest watchmaker of all time. I mean, we can run through, we're talking about equation of time complication was first done by Abraham Louis Breguet. He improved on the Thomas Mudge perpetual calendar system to create a more widely usable perpetual calendar system. He had the first shock protection system, the parachute shock protection system, as are still used in Breguet watches today. I mean, we're talking about even, for example, basic things like, for example, the Breguet hands, which are known as palm hands, but are obviously referred to as Breguet hands. The first watchmaker to use engine turning.
You mentioned a lot of things. Let's start with the gong spring mechanism. Let's dumb that down, because a lot of times when you hear these conversations in regards to, I guess, mechanics. Let's keep it simple. Mechanics, we throw terminology around. To us, it's second nature. Some may not understand what that actually is. So I always ask you to dumb things down a little bit.
Sure. So when we're talking about a gong spring system, we're talking about minute repeaters, right? And in terms of modern minute repeaters, the most widely used ones are the ones with springs and gongs, essentially. And what they will do is the gong will hit against a metallic spring, essentially that's tuned to, make it sound good. And that system was developed by Breguet, right? Breguet was the first one to do it. It's been improved on many times over, obviously, the last few centuries, but he was really the first to do it. We talk about tourbillons.
And he did that in a pocket watch first.
Correct, in a pocket watch, right? Because in the area, there was no such thing as wristwatches until he invented it. Obviously, the first wristwatch for ladies, for the Queen of Naples, which is a line actually that Breguet still makes to this day.
One of the most popular watches, but by men for women, at least in my experience here.
Yeah, and that watch actually is kind of, has a great story. I mean, we still have no idea where the whereabouts of that watch is, right? The original Queen of Naples wristwatch. So I'm sure if it were ever to turn up, it might be the most expensive watch ever sold, right? It's the first original wristwatch ever made.
If I had to guess, I don't think it's in existence. I think it may have been destroyed or lost somewhere.
I hope not. But
I hope not as well. Let's move on to the next thing we discussed.
Yeah, if we're talking about complications, probably my favorite complication, just because of the visual appeal of it, is a tourbillon, right? Again, invented by Breguet. What does it do? Now, tourbillons themselves have evolved a lot over time. Nowadays, in wristwatches, you'll see often 60-second tourbillons. If you go back to the day of Abraham Louis Breguet, tourbillons didn't run in 60 seconds because of the friction of components, right? So whenever a watch is powered, essentially there will be friction between parts. That's why you need lubrication, essentially, to keep them running with different oils and things of that nature. However, in his time, it was more so a 4-minute tourbillon. And the reason was quite simple. Again, it goes back to this idea that we didn't have wristwatches at the time. Pocket watches typically sat in jackets in a kind of one position, and overall the effects of gravity would pull down on the actual escapement itself and affect the timekeeping rates of the watch, which inevitably affected the accuracy of it. By having essentially a rotating cage with the escapement inside of it, it would negate those effects of gravity by pulling down
in layman's terms, if you have a spring that's constantly sitting in the same position, and you have that constant pull, because that pull is constant at a constant rate, which obviously made his job easier because that pull was constant. If the gravitational pull would vary, it'd be almost impossible to do this.
Correct.
So instead of it pulling on one side all the time, as it turns today, usually the 1-minute tourbillons, right? As it pulls, it will pull on different parts more or less equally, therefore essentially negating the effect that gravity has.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was an important invention back in the day, right? Because you have to factor in that back in the day, pocket watches, even for example, marine chronometers, which he made, which were very famous back in the day, were real tools, right? I mean, you have to think about, these were inventions made for explorers even, right? People who navigated the seas. I mean, it was extremely important to calculate longitude and latitude, right? And obviously the accuracy isn't what it is today, where we're talking about minutes, right? Even sometimes tens of minutes in terms of accuracy. But, to have an accurate timekeeping device was extremely important.
You didn't have an iPhone that you can set your watch
well,
to.
It's not just that, right? It's the difference between ending up in, I don't know, the United States versus Cuba or the Dominican Republic, right?
If we do a math on a 5,000 kilometer trip on the seas, and you're off by a minute, that sets you off by tens of miles, of course, and that's where the importance really came in.
So timekeeping devices extremely important, but we go even into the aesthetics of things, right? Things like
let's talk about his perpetual calendar. That's also humongous.
Improving on the perpetual calendar system. Now, originally it was thought that he was the one who first did perpetual calendars. However, it was later found out that it was actually a British watchmaker by the name of Thomas Mudge was the first one to do it. He improved on this system, also added a self-winding system, improved on the self-winding system of Louis Perrellet, made a system that was far more precise and far easier to wind a watch. With
so if you're talking about taking a perpetual calendar, let's say Thomas's perpetual calendar was so-so, and then when Louis put his stamp on it and made it pretty much the standard going forward, who do you credit?
I mean, it's a question of who was the first versus who did it better, right? It's the same idea with Louis Perrellet was the first one to feature an automatic system. Now that's kind of moot in the sense that nobody really uses that system anymore, just because it's not very efficient. However, Breguet's automatic system is far more efficient for winding a watch, particularly wristwatches, but also pocket watches back in the day. We also go into shock protection systems, right? Obviously, these have been done time and time again, be it by Richard Mille or other brands. But the first was Breguet, right? And literally took a pocket watch, threw it down on the ground, just to show that his parachute shock system, was functioning.
What does that look like? Draw that out for me.
Yeah, so there's actually a watch. We'll pop it up on the screen that has that shock protection system kind of visible on the dial. We recently sold that watch, but it's literally.
You're talking about the La Tradition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the 7097 I think is the reference. So it's right there on the actual dial. You can see it right there working. Essentially, what it does is it holds in place the actual balance wheel, the spring, essentially the fine components that are more prone to break.
It does what it does in a car. It's a shock system, right? We have shocks in the car so our car doesn't fall apart when we go over bumps and things of that nature.
Exactly.
And it's more or less the same thing. I'm actually a big fan of the La Tradition. I'm sorry we don't have one here to show you guys, but we can pop it up on the screen as you said. When people first saw that watch, they were like, well, what the hell is this? And I think a lot of people didn't get the concept that was Breguet's way of showing off its traditional watchmaking, showing off the inventions they've done in the past in a raw format. That's what watch was all about.
Yeah, and one thing that Breguet was an innovator for was not just movement components, right? But again, we talked about visual aesthetics of a watch.
Let's talk about your favorite topic. Let's talk about finishes.
Yeah, let's talk about, well, for one, guilloché dials, right? Who was the first to do it? It was Breguet, right? Breguet using...
A guilloché dial is?
Distinctly, I think, a Breguet kind of aesthetic, right? In the sense that this is essentially a plate of metal, typically gold, but sometimes it could even be sterling silver, that's engraved using very, very old machines, using very traditional techniques.
Now, mind you, when he did this, this was done by hand.
Yeah, it was all, they're still done by hand to this day, right? Even, for example, the modern hallmarks of a modern Breguet watch are very distinct, right? Things like, for example, the mid-case, the cold roll mid-case is one of them, soldered on lugs.
Why is this cold rolled?
That's a good question. It's just what it's always been called. I assume it must be the process with which they make the actual case.
Do you think they actually roll the case?
Yeah, there must be some kind of conception to be able to create this fluted mid case. I don't know how they do it, but it's
if you look at this under a microscope, most will say, "Oh my God, a machine did it." But I think the process, the reason they called it cold roll, and don't get me wrong, is because that particular piece that piece of metal, a piece of gold, is actually rolled.
Yeah, it's certainly done by hand, right? These are all handmade cases,
but I think it's rolled. Also. I think it's rolled with. Imagine how they stretch gold, right, through these rolling machines. And I think what happens is they take that piece and they roll it through that machine, and it stamps this in, giving it that absolute equal, finish. Yeah, but
again, we're talking about aesthetical nuances. Palm hands is another thing that's, I think, so distinctly Breguet, right? Breguet hands is they're commonly
And how many companies
have
used that since? Imagine setting a standard 200 years ago on certain things. And for that standard to be followed till this day, and will most likely will continue to be followed for hundreds of years going forward.
And there's some things that even we forget to mention. Like, for example, I'm wearing a Laurent Ferrier, shout out to Laurent Ferrier, it's a Gallet Square. This features an escapement. It's called the natural escapement, originally invented by Breguet. And again, it just...
Difference between natural and...
Yeah, so essentially what you have, generally speaking, the vast majority of wristwatches will use a lever escapement. This is a very efficient system, very easy to use. The tolerances aren't super tight. So the majority of brands will use them just because the system itself is very easy to regulate. Now, a natural escapement is one that has kind of two, essentially, escape wheels.
We can throw the diagram up on the screen.
Exactly. We'll throw up a diagram up on the screen, but it's very technical. Essentially what it is you're working on very tight tolerances, microns essentially. Now this was eventually developed by Breguet back in the 17 or 1800s, and it couldn't be redone for another 150 plus years until...
Who redid it first?
George Daniels, and both of his Space Traveler pocket watches. Right? We're talking about, again, another Mount Rushmore level watchmaker. He's certainly on my Mount Rushmore, but it just speaks to the incredible quality.
I like that analogy. Who else do you have up there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple. I think we can make a full separate video just on the greatest watchmakers of all time. But yeah, again, just speaks to...
Well, Breguet certainly deserves a spot.
Yeah, no doubt about it. He's the inventor of things that obviously are often overlooked. Again, something that couldn't be redone by anybody until 150, almost 200 years later, and it took an absolute genius to do it, right? I'm going
to take a twist or a turn from the technical part of the show. And you guys let me know in the comments, because one of the things that, again, oftentimes we'll throw jargon around of this technical stuff, and we just assume that everybody that's listening knows what they're talking about. So I often ask Marco to dumb things down, draw it out on a diagram and things of that nature. Because, hey, listen, this is the stuff that makes your collection tick, right? And this is the history behind it. But I'm going to take a turn, and we brought out all these Breguets, except I told Mark, I said, don't forget to grab the two tourbillons we have, and we found out that they're in service, so it's okay, we can just the same pop them on the screen. I want to talk about a tourbillon from a different perspective, from a market perspective, because a lot of times we talk about market values, what's the market look like, what it looked like, or what will it look like. For the most part, that's an educated guess, of course, but tourbillon. When I started in the industry, going back 20-some years now, it's actually been over 20 years now. I've been talking about being in the business for 20 years for 2 years. So it's been a little more now at this point. But I guess 20, let's call it 21. Tourbillon, or horological complication, I should say, was the flex.
Yeah.
Right? Today's day and age, the flex is popularity. What's popular on social media, what are the stars wearing, and things of that nature. So you will live in a world where a seemingly plastic watch like a Richard Mille is now become, a $300,000-$400,000 watch, and it's a time-only watch, right? Mm-hmm. So we've gotten away from the flex of horology, which I think is on its way back, and it's on its way back hard. I think the recent correction in the market of the hype models made people wake up a little bit, open up the blinders a bit, and say, oh, wait a minute, what am I actually getting for the money? And nobody is safe. What goes up can't come down regardless of what it is, right? Nobody is safe. But when I started, the biggest flex you could possibly have was a tourbillon. And arguably the minute repeater, if you had to put complications in order on its own, the minute repeater probably is a bigger complication than that of a tourbillon. At least that's how it always has been looked at. But in my time, a tourbillon was unmistakably the biggest flex you can think of, which is why you had all these companies coming out of the woodworks that, you had their name 300 years ago, and then all of a sudden the company's revived and are making these uber complicated tourbillons, which they're buying from other watchmakers, putting in their watches and pricing the watches at $300,000 plus. I don't want to mention any names, right? But a lot of them, those companies are not around anymore. You had a wave of cheaper tourbillons, right? Companies that had no business making tourbillons, like a Tag Heuer, for example, Breitling. What business does Breitling have making a tourbillon, right? And funny enough, the Breitling tourbillons, they almost all look fake. Like they look like a fake watch because there was a lot of Breitling fakes done to make it look like a tourbillon. But tourbillon was the biggest flex. And one of the reasons is because you can unmistakably tell when a watch is a tourbillon. It's that hole at 6 o'clock, right? In fact, a lot of watches out there even took it to the next level where they made watches with escapements visible to make it look like a tourbillon, to where you can easily make a mistake that
what
that's
I call it's a ghetto tourbillon.
The ghetto tourbillons is what we like to call them, right? Ulysse Nardin did it, right? A lot of companies out there did, but I don't knock Ulysse Nardin for it because Nardin made some wonderful tourbillons in the past, and they still do. Yeah. So flexing with a tourbillon was a big deal when I started, and that lasted for quite a while, and slowly but surely, hype took over, but that hype didn't start with the hype of a popular watch. It started with the hype of watches as an investment, especially leading up to the '08 crisis. All of a sudden, some of these watches started going up in value. Then they all took a beating, and all the Nautiluses crashed in value. And about 6-7 years ago is when we start seeing, again, the rise of the Nautilus, the rise of the Royal Oak, and things of that nature. And they all stem from one thing, and that thing was watch as an investment. Look at this limited edition offshore. I bought it for $20,000. It's now $40,000. I bought this Nautilus, and all these things are going up in value. As that happens, attention comes off of the horological aspect, and all of a sudden, you guys trading in $100,000 tourbillon for a plain Jane Nautilus, which made no sense.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking a lot about things coming and going in waves, right? And at a certain point, people tended to neglect the idea that watches were a passion-based pursuit, or at least they should be to a certain extent, right? They shouldn't be, a stock portfolio that you trade in and out of and try to speculate essentially on. But again, in the same kind of idea, things coming and going in waves, you see more and more collectors, those Nautilus collectors, those Richelieu collectors, looking at these kind of pieces, seeing the value in them, seeing, oh my God, I have this watch, versus something like, anything here on the table, which trades at far less a premium, and that is better. I mean, I think inarguably a better made watch, and yet it doesn't get the respect or the shine that it deserves. Now, I think the state of the modern Breguet brand is, listen, they do a lot to not gain the respect of collectors. One of them, the best example I could give is the Type 20. It's one of my favorite watches, has military history, and they seem to always release the best edition, like a few small iterations or for charity auctions. Even they'll make their kind of best watches typically exclusive to like 20 pieces. They'll do this all the time, and so they never really develop the kind of collector base, but you see them starting to
developed the collector base of sports watches.
Correct, and that's really one thing that they tried to do with the Marine. They never got, I'd say, the popularity of like a Nautilus or an overseas.
Hold on a second. The Marine Breguet Chrono. The problem.
But it did come back down to earth, right?
Yeah,
it may have traded
the Marine Breguet Chrono at the time that it came out was, oh my God. Well, mind you, if we go back to that time, we're talking about early 2000s. Mm-hmm. We're talking about Breguet was at the top of the game in the Russian market, the Ukrainian market. It was on top of the Asian market, believe it or not. But for the most part, it was the Russian market and Ukrainian market and former Soviet republic, I should say, right? Former Soviet Union, took Breguet to new heights. A Breguet Marine Chrono, at the time, every watch, and I mean every watch, was trading at a discount.
Yeah.
Except for limited edition offshores, believe it or not. They were one of the few pieces that were trading over list, right? You could walk into a Patek dealer and pick up a stainless steel Patek at the time. But Breguets were trading at pretty much virtually no discount, specifically the Breguet Marine Chrono. Why? Because you had a brand that became popular prior to the Breguet Marine Chrono. And they were smart to realize, hey, we got to take advantage of the market, of the sports market. The bigger is better market, really, is what they were trying to take advantage of. And they came out with the Breguet Marine Chrono. They did it in white gold, they did it in yellow gold, later they did it in rose gold, and then much later they did a new version in stainless steel. But they never ran with that, meaning that watch has been the same forever.
Yeah.
Right? No additional complications were added. They didn't make the tourbillon. Yeah. That was the ultimate flex. The Marine Breguet tourbillon was the ultimate flex. They never kept up with keeping that fan base. Because if you think about it, even when they did the Breguet Marine Chrono, they didn't come out with a steel version until some 10 years later. It was all in precious metals, right? And the Type 20, Type 21, Type 22, leaves a lot to be desired, if you ask me.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Especially because a lot of these times they're using what's called a cam-operated chronograph as opposed to a column wheel. Obviously, a column wheel being far superior in terms of feeling, actuation, what have you. But you see this a lot with Breguet in terms of like the segments, right? I think 2000s was a great period, basically when Nicholas Hayek was at the head of it. Unfortunately, he passed away far too early and didn't get to realize and reinvigorate the Breguet brand. But even, I would say, you go back to under the Chaumet direction, when Daniel Roth was the head watchmaker at the time, these have become extremely collectible watches, right? The early 2000s, I would say, even the late 90s, and especially the late 80s, early 90s, when Daniel Roth was at the helm under the Chaumet direction, Breguet specifically, those tourbillons, the chronographs, the complications that he was making, even like, for example, just a basic 3137, have gone sky high in price. I mean, we're talking about like they've really shot up in price because people are coming to realize and appreciate, okay, you're getting one, the Breguet brand, the traditional watchmaking, the incredible movement finishing, the incredible design language, right? Because a lot of these will be inspired by old Breguet pocket watches. Again, he was a visionary for his time, way ahead of his time. And so these can be replicated and still look very modern today, even though they may be 200-year-old designs. And I think, again, when we're talking about watchmaking, these on the table here, and really most modern Breguet watches are extremely underrated for what they are.
Well, let's go back to the Type 20. Do you know how the Type 20, I think I may have told you this, how the Type 20 watch was made? For those of you that didn't hear this, Breguet Type 20 made for the French Air Force, right? French Air Force came to Breguet, said, we need some chronographs for our pilots, right? And they made a few. And when they tried to come up with a name, they couldn't get very creative. And the way the Type 20 was called the Type 20 is because of the contract number with the French Air Force, which was contract number 20. Yeah. And I had one of those actually for a while. I wore around and I ended up selling it. It was actually the first watch I bought from Adam, from Menta Watches. I had the one that did not have the Breguet signature, the actual military one. In the back, it actually had dates because those watches would get passed on from pilot to pilot. They didn't get to keep them. And then later they came out with a consumer version that actually said Breguet on it. And I was always up in the air, like, which one do I want? Do I want the one that says Breguet? Or do I really the low-key flex that says nothing on it, where most people would think it's a $2 vintage piece, right? Yep. And I guess I wish I didn't sell it now that I talk about it.
These have exploded in price, right? Yeah. These have absolutely quadrupled, like five-tupled in price. First of all, they're auction-only pieces now, essentially. Very rarely traded hands privately on the market. But again, I mean, it just speaks to people are coming to realize, you know, it's funny because we have left the hype market because of, I would say, the downturn in the market, right? People are kind of less into the, okay, I have to buy it now because it's going to be up in price,
right.
You know, kind of 2 weeks later.
FOMO is gone,
right.
But the hype is still there.
But you see also the perception of people changing. They're coming to appreciate, and this is, I would say, the natural wave of watch collecting. People are coming to appreciate the high horology of things, the watchmaking, the way
we're talking about a consumer. They got into this market due to the hype. Mm-hmm. Be it the reason of the stuff going up in value like crazy. Be it Instagram, be it YouTube, be it influencers, be it what have you. The person who wasn't into watches as much or wasn't into watches at all stepped foot into the market. And now, again, they're starting to open up the blinders and they're starting to dig a little bit deeper. They have their Bubba Watson, they have their Rolexes, they have their Nautilus. Say, oh, wait a minute, what else is out there? And as they're starting to understand watchmaking in general, as they're starting to understand horology and history specifically, they start to open up their eyes to things such as this. Yep. One of the biggest contributors to that, believe it or not, is still also hype. If you look at auction results over the last few years and you look at some of the independent watchmakers, when people see a Daniels fetch $4 million in auction and it's seemingly a plain watch, and they're like, well, why is this that much? And they start to read and they start to learn. And then they're saying, well, I can't afford a $4 million watch. And they start to look for alternatives. And alternatives are going to be your classic watches like Breguet. Some of the alternatives are some of the newer comers like Lange. They will look at some of the older, you know, semi-complicated, I like to call them paddocks, like annual calendars and things of that nature that have the heritages, that have the horology. And because look, a guy like Daniels, you know, where is his inspiration coming from?
It's
coming from pieces such as this.
I mean, he literally wrote the book on Breguet, right? So literally the entire book on Breguet is written by George Daniels, which has inspired so many watchmakers. Lest we forget even some of the modern pieces. Like, for example, one of the most iconic watches from independent watchmaker is F.P. Journe Resonance. Where did that come from? It's a Breguet clock, right? It was actually gifted to him. I forget by who. I think it was his uncle or something like that. But it was a resonance clock gifted to him, and then he recreated that complication in a wristwatch. So yeah, I mean, Breguet is the greatest watchmaker of all time. Again, we've talked about technical standpoint, aesthetic standpoint, but also what he has contributed in the minds of some of the real geniuses of today, right? Because he's the one who has inspired and really created a mindset for watchmakers to push the boundaries with respect to what has been done based on what he has accomplished way ahead of his time, probably 200 years ahead of his time.
So to switch gears a little bit and to talk about market and market values, I want to start with one question to you. And me and you went to Watch Time.
Yeah.
And we hung out in the Swatch group area, I guess you like to call it. I think who was there?
Blancpain was Breguet, and then there was, I think it was...
Blancpain?
Yeah, it was just Blancpain and Breguet, I'm pretty sure.
Blancpain, Breguet.
No, I think the rest was a separate.
Okay, yeah. So, and we had a conversation with Blancpain, mentioned the guy's name, and you remember what I told him. It wasn't so nice when he asked me my thoughts on the brand, and I said, listen, I love the brand. Great watchmaking, great watches. Problem is, you guys have been the same since I've been doing this for 20 years, right?
Yeah.
You can only milk the Aqualung so long, right? I feel that the Swatch Group suppresses a brand like Breguet, suppresses a brand like Blancpain, along with some of the other brands that's under that group. At which point do you identify and say, holy shit, we have the godfather of all watchmaking under our group, and we need to start moving maybe perhaps in a bit of a different directions, whether it's low in production, whether it's coming out with an actual sports line that can be followed for years.
I hate saying this, but I feel like it has to be said. I feel you can be a modern watch brand without having some kind of sports watch to kind of anchor everything else, right? You saw with Vacheron. Vacheron was, an overlooked, for lack of a better term, was a dog brand for years.
It was dead in the water.
Right, it was
the
absolutely
only thing
dead
that was
in the
keeping
water.
it is, I think it was around sort of like mid to end of 2000s. You had the Asian market that dubbed the brand to be a lucky brand, and all of a sudden it was selling like hotcakes.
Right, but otherwise it was pretty much irrelevant in the watch industry. They came out with the 3rd gen overseas. Eventually, people got priced out of the Nautilus and Royal Oak, realized, holy crap, the overseas is a really good looking watch, Holy Trinity, great value. And then what happened, right? They started to look elsewhere, right, at all their dress watches. So you need that sports watch anchor. I think Breguet is missing it. I don't like the modern marine line. I much prefer this. First of all, the quality of these ones are a lot better, in my personal opinion. The case is handmade, the dial is handmade, guilloché, and even the movement, I think, is better in terms of finishing with a guilloché rotor. It's much more elaborative in terms of overall movement finishing. But I think they need a better sports watch. And then also, one thing that I will say is that they make too many of the same looking watches. They need to cut their line dramatically, right?
Like Lange.
Exactly. Lange did that. They were making too much of the same thing, right? And then they ended up cutting their lines overall.
They cut the Saxonia by 70%.
Much more streamlined, much more nuanced in terms of design. There was real differences, right? To me, seeing this watch in 4 different case metals with 5 of the same dials is not interesting to me, right? It puts me to sleep, and it does for most modern consumers.
And that's a beautiful perpetual, by the way.
It's absolutely beautiful, right? It's a shame because it's such an insane value. We're talking about hand-engraved movement, hand-engraved automatic winding rotor. It's just an absolutely phenomenal watch, and yet it's completely overlooked because it seemingly looks the same like its rose gold counterpart.
And if you look at some of the smaller case sizes, right?
Yep.
And then the minute you jump up to a bigger case size.
These are still incredible value. Handmade watch under 15,000.
Looks the same.
Yeah.
I think I will show you the equivalent. We talked about Lange, since we brought Lange up, and I told you like one of my favorite watches from Lange was the Time Zone, right? Well, one of my favorite watches from Breguet, that looks like a constant check-in, by the way, the smiley watch or the clown watch or whatever it is the alarm. The 5707 BA or BB, which is the white gold or the yellow gold, is absolutely one of my favorites. To me, this is a staple. This is one of the best-selling models. When I started out in the business, everybody wanted this watch. It was trading at about mid-20s, low to mid-20s. It was trading, and right now it's trading at around the $20,000 price range because these have come down in value. Mind you, today it's trading at 20. About 3-4 years ago, this watch was trading in the low teens. You can find these online for $15,000, even $14,000. The Breguet alarm is unmistakably one of those watches. I would love to see exactly that. If you want to talk about perpetual calendars, this particular perpetual calendar, this is the same one as the white one you held up, but the layout of this perpetual calendar is very, very untraditional, right? And that sort of sinks to me much as the alarm piece because, again, untraditional layout, unmistakably the alarm. You can tell that this is the alarm watch. When you start getting into some of the classiques and stuff, they start to seemingly look all the same. Here's one with a power reserve, another classique. Yeah. The classique line is, as you said, it can put you to sleep, but the value is still there. And the next question people are going to ask themselves, well, where do I go? I'm a fan of going backwards. So when you're looking at some of the older perpetual calendars, such as this guy here, the 5030, right? When you start looking at the older moon phase pieces, they're going to be smaller, they're going to be classic, but this is the overall look. And I think this is where these are those future collectibles you list, much like we talked about.
Well, it's not just that. We also see changing market conditions. We've been saying a lot, 2023 is the year of sweats and dress, right? But it's actually a thing. I'm not even kidding with you. The trends are changing. People are gravitating far more towards dress watches than they were ever before. And I think you can't choose a better outlet than going for something like the godfather of all watches.
So let's talk about, again, circle back to independence that sort of spotlighted, starting with George Daniels fetching crazy numbers in auctions, and then looking at some Laurent Ferriers, and looking at some pieces that normally people wouldn't even pay attention to, that would trade at pennies on a dollar in the secondary, or you'd be hard pressed to find somebody to buy your independent, right? Yeah. And the question becomes, well, wait a minute. I like the dressy look. I understand the value behind horology, And the question becomes, why not go with the godfather of all watchmaking while these prices are still hovering? Some of these are around stainless steel Rolex prices.
I mean, we're talking about Breguet Classique. We're talking about under 15,000. It's cheaper than a Batman GMT for a handmade watch in gold, right? Versus a steel sports watch. Again, very different, radically different.
And this goes back to what I said when we said, it used to be that tourbillon was the flex, right?
Yep.
Where today it's how quickly will someone recognize the watch on your wrist? And thank you, social media. I mean, we're the culprits of that. This is what we do, right? We all know that if I tomorrow will take a Breguet Classique or even the alarm piece, which I absolutely love. I love this watch in yellow and in white. I like them both equally. And I put that on Instagram, and then the next post up is going to be a John Mayer Daytona, or actually no, a Rolex GMT Batman, which is around the same price range. Where am I going to get more likes? Because we live in a flex culture, and that flex culture is now on steroids, again, mainly due to social media's efforts. And at the end of the day, this is what's happening. I'm just finally starting to see people saying, I'm not going to be influenced by that next Instagram post or that story or what the next guy is wearing at a club. I am going to really open up the blinders. I'm going to look at horology. And if you guys are one of those guys that's slowly but surely starting to have sort of that, I don't want to call it a change of heart because there's room for both. I've always said there's absolutely nothing wrong with flexing. Rolex, first money watch, all day, every day. But if you're someone out there that's now starting to say, well, wait a minute, I'm ready to open up my eyes. I have enough hype. I want to look at horology and I want to look at history, specifically history. I can't think of a better place to start than with a Breguet watch.
Absolutely. I'd echo everything you just said. I think when it comes to watchmaking, again, you can't tell the story of watches. You cannot even describe modern day watchmakers without talking about the influence of Breguet. He is, without a doubt, by far and away, the greatest watchmaker.
And then sometimes they'll throw you a curveball. So this was a combination of bigger and better. I think this was also, because look, there's literally a musical box inside this watch, right? It's called the musical. I don't know what the proper.
Yeah, I assume it's that.
So, this is something that when this came out, I sold them, and I sold them well because, oh my God, all of a sudden, all my guys that have huge wrists that always wanted a Breguet, but every time they would put it on, it looked like they were wearing a ring on their wrist. They were like, oh, I must have this. But then it quickly lost its appeal because based on a price range, I mean, this thing retailed over $100,000, and the fact that the novelty of playing the music, it plays Bach, actually. We can play it. Hold on a second. Let me make sure that the power reserve is up on the musical box.
Which is insane. To feature a complication that can play a full song like that, right? We talk about Jacob & Co. with the Godfather watch, things of that nature. I mean, to play Bach in a watch is pretty damn impressive.
Let me wind that mechanism. Where's my mic? Which symphony it is?
It's a good question. I'm sure somebody in the YouTube comments can tell us. They said it's a bus driver song. But again, stuff like this is it's them thinking outside of the box, and sometimes that flops, sometimes it works. Let's think of, I guess, what is the most impressive watch you think to date from Breguet when it comes to horology? I mean, there's so many good ones. There's double tourbillons. There's chain and fusee tourbillons. Again, we talk about the marine equation of time tourbillon. They really are a cornerstone and a powerhouse when it comes to watch complications because that is their wheelhouse, right? When we talk about Breguet invented so many incredible complications. He was, one of the most innovative minds for his time, and so the modern Breguet brand reflects that. So there's so many incredible watches to choose from, and all of the best part for the consumer is...
Pick one on this table.
I mean, if I had to choose one, for me, personally, I would go with something like this. Perpetual calendar with a fully hand-engraved movement. I mean, this is just absolutely incredible. You get all the hallmarks of Breguet, guilloché dial, palm hands.
I'm going to go with one of my favorites, and that's going to be the alarm, or reveal du tar, as they call it. And if I had to pick a second, I would go with a perpetual, but it's that old 50-30 perpetual at the end that really, really sings to me because it has that vintagey look, if you will, that classic look. That's what his pocket watch would look like 200 some years ago, and that's probably why that's so appealing to me. I'm going to finish this off with a question to you. I am Breguet on this watch group today, and I come to Marco and say, hey, you know what, you're a smart young kid. You seem to know what you're talking about. how do we revamp ourselves going forward? What do we do?
Yeah, I think, again, you need that cornerstone sports piece. I think that the Marine just clearly isn't it for them, right? They tried and tried and tried. They've revamped it now, I think, 3 times. So the Marine isn't it. I think you need something.
It had its run.
On an integrated bracelet, Marine. I would say go back to the days, early 2000s, even I would say go back even further, under the Daniel Roth days, right? Start recreating those incredible watches that Daniel Roth created. But also, I would love to see Breguet do something different. Because it's good to pay homage to tradition. It's good to pay respect to the man who essentially created one of the greatest and most historic brands of all time. But at the same time, in the spirit of an independent watchmaker, and in the spirit of Breguet himself, create something new. Reinvent yourself. Create something that has never been done, that may be shocking for Breguet consumers, but that will capture the minds of watch collectors because the Breguet brand needs it.
Fair enough. Again, I can't really add much to that. Reinvent yourself is obviously one good key point. A key sports model is another good point. I think you mentioned earlier, which is also important to mention, that is cut production down a bit.
Yeah. Streamline.
I would say by streamline, condense some of the models, right? Make less models within this. The Classique line has a gajillion models. It's too many.
Yeah.
Right? Would you say to Breguet, flex your muscles? Because we don't really know what's going on internally right now in terms of watchmaking and things of that nature, right? Would you say flex your muscles and show the world like, hey, how about a resonance? By the guy that invented it.
Yeah, no, listen, it's not just in terms of complication. I think it's also in terms of design language especially, right? It goes back to this idea that Breguet watches have looked the same now, essentially since the conception of the brand. Because a lot of the time they'll pay homage to Breguet watches of the past. And that's totally okay. I love the idea of paying homage to the past. But you also want to push forward and move forward and create something new. So I think reinventing themselves, be it in the case design.
Sounds like they need a Max or an Eric on their team.
I think so. I think they need a visionary that will restore the Breguet brand like they had with Daniel Roth in the 80s, like they had with Nicholas Hayek in the early 2000s and late 90s. And they need that again.
Well, guys, we left you with a lot of food for thought. And again, key takeaways from this is if you're someone that has gone through the hype phase, someone that's looking for something historical, something with high quality, right? Breguet is a good option. I'm not saying it's the only option, but I'm saying it is a good option. If you're someone that, again, sweats with dress, right? Dress with sweats or whatever you call it, certainly is a good option for you. But if you're someone that has never seen a Breguet, has never handled a Breguet, in the very least, I ask that go out there and do a little bit of reading. In fact, the book from George Daniels, I think is a great place to start. And careful, you will catch a bug. I will tell you this. Whenever I sold a first Breguet to a client, they've always come back and bought more. And once they were able to sit there and loop the watch, break down the watch, especially if you get a little bit of complication, you get that, the finishes and everything else and the hand engraved movements, it's something you can stare at for hours. I'm sure Marco has done that numerous times on a dark night by himself in a room somewhere. I'm messing with you. But other than that, guys, look, just a little bit of information. Obviously, plenty of more is available online. You're welcome to do your research. If you have any questions, you can reach out directly to Marco. He answers all of his DMs and all of his emails, which is marco@luxurybazaar.com. So with that said, we're going to wrap this one up. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. As always, don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe. Give Marco a follow on Instagram because he does share a lot of this cool information on his Instagram account. And we'll see you on the next edition of What's on My Desk.